So I think there's a number of challenges that we're going to see over the next 12 months as an industry. Some sectors will feel it more than others, but I think there's some generic things. So at the moment, what's on my hot list, certainly materials supply. Which is now sort of we're starting to see some price inflation from a materials perspective and some real sort of shortages in some parts of the sector, and the supply chain actually being able to get their hands on materials. So I think that's a big challenge for us. I think one of being my bonnet for a number of years has been around actually the labour force, the workforce, and the skills that we need to be really successful and thrive as a sector, and actually sort of what is really being done to focus on that, to make sure we've not just got the materials that we need to build things, but we've got the people coming through actually to sort of do that. And I think that's a massive focus in particular on young people, on providing skills, on upskilling and on reskilling. So I think industry-wide those are challenges we're going to face. I think when it comes to particular sectors, there are some that are really obvious. So the retail sector, for example, has had an absolutely torrid time. You could put hospitality and leisure in the same bracket, but I think what you'll start to see is a bounce back because people have been locked up for 15 months. They're desperate to get out. And certainly my household, which is like 4 young adults in it, they are hitting sort of the hospitality side and leisure side very hard wherever they can. So I suspect that will bounce back quicker. But retail basically is still working out its model, and there's still a lot of overhead possibly to flush through. Retailers who will no longer be able to pay the rental levels that they were paying pre-COVID, that's going to wash through, from an operational sort of perspective for them, but actually from a landlord perspective, property owner perspective, that will ultimately sort of go to value. So I think we're still waiting to see that adjust, and I think that sector is going to be challenged for some time. The office sector is really interesting. It's a sector I love. It's a sector I've worked for big corporates for most of my career and therefore had a lot of office stock. And I've been involved in basically the evolution of office stock throughout my career. But I think actually what's happened is that you've definitely got some dislocation in terms of how people want to work. And it could be age related as well. What do I mean by that? Younger people who are living in sort of 1 and 2 bedroom apartments in city centres actually are really craving being back in an office and that social environment that comes from it and the learning. Whereas actually you've got people who basically have families at a particular stage who are looking for more of a mix and wanting to retain more of that sort of work-life balance that they've had as they've been through COVID. But I think you've also got an awful lot of people who throughout COVID have worked really hard, and they've worked to keep doing their job in a very different way actually, and making sure their business delivers, and they've found it really tough. We've got a lot of tired people in our organisation, but actually virtually every CEO or senior person I speak to a business will say the same. So we've got to try to find a way of making sure that when people do start to come back into the office, we can actually bring some balance in, which actually means for me, really exciting thing is I think office spaces are going to continue to evolve again as well. I think industrial and logistics still red hot. I read a piece by one of the Savills researchers a couple of days ago, because actually not only was there a wall of institutional money trying to find stock, whether it was physically built or land with consent or just land, actually what you've now got is the material shortage starting to impact on the timeline of what's being built. So you've got another sort of squeeze coming, and that wall of money is still looking for somewhere to go. But it's underpinned by, I think, again, some structural changes. So we all know about big box logistics. We all know about businesses, sort of like Amazon and the Hermes and the DHL of this world, and some of the major retailers taking very big footprints. But the other thing that's happened is Brexit's meant that some supply chains have been onshored, which has actually driven underlying demand for industrial and logistics space. You've got new industries emerging, particularly in renewable technologies. So on some of our sites, we're getting a lot of inquiries from people who want to build plants to manufacture. So it's not just about actually that logistics piece, it's the industrial piece. And then I think you've also got businesses, and again look at hospitality as a sector, who diversified how they got their product to market. So their restaurants and bars were closed, but actually a lot of them went online and delivered meal boxes or pre-prepared food or actually cocktails. You name it, you could get virtually anything that you wanted for a great night in online. And I think some of that will stay, because I think some of those businesses have realised that it was growth for them, and actually it's provided some resilience in their model. So the evictions moratorium being extended into the end of Q1 next year, I think is a really interesting one, and for some property businesses that is going to continue to cause quite a lot of pain. Business like Harworth, where the majority of our tenants are industrial or logistics, we don't actually sort of have the same pressures, for example, that an investor or property owner will have if they've got a big retail sort of mix in their tenant base, or even to some extent hospitality and leisure. And I think actually, to me, ultimately, this is all about fairness. You know, landlords don't want to lose tenants. It's much harder in the sort of market that some of that stock is in to replace tenants, you know, sort of should they leave. And landlords, I think, have worked really quite responsibly and very hard, the major propcos, to basically be able to support their tenants through, you know, so what has been a really tough time. If they're not trading, you know, there's been an acceptance that they don't have money to pay rent. So I think landlords have worked really well coming up with ways of trying to sort of balance the equation. You know, so you know, rent holidays in return for term being added onto the end of the lease or whatever it may be. You know, there's been a number of sort of tools that have been deployed. There have and are even today been some tenants who basically can pay and haven't paid, and tenants who've taken advantage of both furlough and things like business rates relief and government loans, actually, that have continued to sort of trade throughout. And that actually, I think, you know, there's probably a different lens that you might look at those tenants through to try to sort of get this equilibrium and fairness between actually sort of how landlords and tenants view not just the end of the moratorium, but what goes from there. Because I think fundamentally, particularly in retail and hospitality, you are going to have some real structural reform in the sorts of lease arrangements that, you know, sort of those sectors actually have with the property sector. And, you know, sort of all of that is caught up with, you know, sort of continuing to the extent of the moratorium. I get why the government are doing it, but actually at some point there is a problem that actually needs to be dealt with and needs to be resolved. So I feel really quite optimistic about the prospects for the industry over the next 12 to 24 months for a number of reasons. We're really good at bouncing back. Property by nature is resilience. Some parts of our sort of our industry are going to come from a very sort of all-time low, and actually sort of will bounce back to, you know, a relative high compared to that. Might not be as far as people want, but I think the reality of it is we're an industry that is resilient. We are creative, we are innovative, and we do adapt. And actually, we're really important to the government.